Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Advocates for Children ACCES-VR training. We're going to get started in a few moments. Just so you're aware, this session will be recorded. I'll give a few more tips about the training as a few more people come in. Thank you for joining us. We just launched a poll. If you wouldn't mind just responding to the poll. We'd love to see who's here and who is joining us today. All righty. We've got a couple of parents, a couple of professionals. We got a nice distribution throughout the city. So why don't we slowly get started? So my name is Alex Elagudin. I am the project director for the post-secondary readiness project at Advocates for Children. We are a team solely focused, dedicated to transition-related services and helping students with disabilities plan for life after school. And that includes getting to graduation, whatever that may look like, and then planning for either college access, vocational training, or employment, or whatever that is. Today's training is about ACCES-VR. It's a state agency that helps people with disabilities explore their job interest and find a job. Today's training is being recorded. You can submit questions in the Q&A. Some of the questions I may take while we're recording. Can we start the recording actually? Oh, it's already being recorded. I apologize. And some questions, if you have individual questions, more specific ones, we'll stop the recording at the end and I'll be able to take those questions as well. So what is ACCES-VR? ACCES-VR is an agency that has an array of services, as you'll see today, that are meant to help people with disabilities find a job. Now, the spectrum of age we'll talk about. What does that look like for kids in high school? What does that look like for young adults? And what does that look like for older adults, which we won't be covering today, but it's important to know that you can get certain ACCES-VR services at any point in life. And that may be if you have a disability that comes on later, or a variety of other reasons you might need it in your 30s or your 40s. At ACCES-VR, there are vocational rehabilitation counselors that help and guide you through the process. And what is the process? It's an array of services that can assist you with reaching your employment goal. And before we get started, we have one more poll before we go on to the next slide that we're going to launch. This will help as this will help me a little bit as we go forward in terms of what examples and references we'll try to use. And we're also very curious to know who we have in the audience. We'll give you a minute for this poll. All right, as you're finishing that up, I will move on to, oh, there we go. Got it. So we have a good amount of autism representation and some developmental disabilities. Got it, beautiful. So let's talk about ACCES-VR eligibility. Who is eligible? You must be at least 14 years old. You must have a disability. You must be a US citizen, or otherwise be able to work. In terms of having a disability, we'll talk a little bit more about disability documentation and what kind of documentation you can provide to document your disability. Importantly, there are other criteria that ACCES-VR looks at when determining your eligibility. Does your disability create a barrier to employment? That's important. You have to identify what that barrier is. Can the student or young adult benefit from the rehab services? We'll talk about that. Vocational rehab services are required to achieve employment, meaning without ACCES-VR, you would not otherwise be able to be employed. And there's age 14 is interesting because although legally you're allowed to start at age 14, which is considered the age once you start aging into transition services and planning, there's not a lot of services that ACCES-VR has available at the age of 14. It's very limited because at 14, they're not really able to create a work plan. So it's certain things like internships, certain other limited counseling. But when ACCES-VR becomes particularly relevant is once you start getting to your junior or senior year, once you're about 16 years old, once you're within a year or two of graduating. Then there's an array of other services that we're going to talk about that really can help you to understand what's available and how to move forward toward your career. So some additional information about eligibility and being approved for services. So I like to describe it as there are two kind of levels of eligibility within ACCES-VR, and that is there's a general eligibility for services. This is your main application that we're going to talk about in a second. This is a review of your disability documentation, and it's the entire initial process of, are you a candidate for ACCES-VR? And unlike certain other programs, even somewhat different from special education in the DOE, you must be determined to be eligible based on the criteria described. Now, just because you've been approved for ACCES-VR services and determined to be eligible, that does not mean you will receive every service that they cover. We're going to go through in a few slides many services that they cover. Each one of those services must be approved on its own. It's based on your assessments and evaluations, whether you have a neuropsych evaluation, whether you have some other assessments. And I guess what that goes to say is, you know, in theory, if you come in to ACCES-VR and your goal is to become a veterinarian because you love pets and that's what you want to do, you will not initially be approved for veterinary school. That is something you can grow into, and we'll talk more about that. Your requests for services not only are based on assessments, they have to be related to and justified by career goals, and there has to be a reasonable expectation of completion and benefit. Now, this is coming pretty much directly from the ACCES-VR guidelines. We're going to talk about what all these mean as we move forward. There's also a financial need component to ACCES-VR. Some services are not based on financial need. They're available to anyone. They're considered non-base need services, and we'll talk about some. I'm not going to cover all of them because it's a lot, but you should know that there's an array of other services like college tuition, for example, that are based on your family income and assets. 1 second, sorry. So there's a couple of questions coming in through the chat. I will get to those in a couple minutes. So you may be expected to contribute to the cost of certain services. That's something you should be aware of. I will say the one thing that I've learned about working with ACCES-VR over the years is everything is individualized. Everything depends on the circumstances. They do a financial review. It depends what services you ask for. You may ask for 5 or 6 or 10 services. Some of those services will fall into the category of their non-financial need-based services, and others may not. And then they will do formulas and calculations. So it's a little bit complicated, but once you're assigned a counselor at ACCES-VR, they can work through all that with you. Additionally, there's a comparable benefits requirement. So if you're going to college, for example, and you're eligible for financial aid, maybe a TAP or a Pell Grant, you would need to apply for that first before ACCES-VR kicks in and helps with your tuition. And the same goes for certain other types of things, whether you have some medical needs or certain other needs, you will be required to apply for other benefits if they are available. And we could have a whole training just on that, but just something to be aware of as you go through the process. So next is the application. Next is the application process. What does that look like? So first, you got to get an application, fill it out, complete it, turn it in. Turning it in, you can submit it by email, you can submit it by mail, or you can drop it off in person. I know email sounds like the easiest way to submit the application. I would highly recommend you turn it in person and mail it, because when you email it, it goes to Albany, to the state ed, New York State Ed Agency, and then it takes a while before that email gets to the district office. All ACCES-VR services are handled through the district office. Your best bet, I would say, is to turn it in person. Somebody can, sometimes they'll look at it, make sure you have everything you need, and then it'll soon, hopefully usually within weeks, but sometimes it can take a few months, and they have a backlog after COVID. It can take a few months before you are scheduled with a counselor for an interview. Now, you see here marked is you should submit disability documentation. You can submit an IEP if you have one. If you have a neuropsych or a psychoed, certainly submit that. Whatever your documentation is, as long as it's within the last 2 years or so, you should submit that with your application. It'll help move things faster in terms of what can be developed. If you don't have an assessment, if you don't have a neuropsych, or you don't have a vocational assessment, that is something ACCES-VR can pay for, and we'll talk about that. So once you submit your application, an interview with a counselor will be scheduled. You'll learn about your rights and responsibilities, and then you'll go towards creating an IEP, which is an individualized plan of employment, which we'll talk about later as we go. But that IEP, IPE, sorry, not IEP, is incredibly important, because that'll outline all the steps and services that ACCES-VR will be working with you on. So documentation to bring, certainly you want to bring your ID, birth certificate, social security card. This basic list of documents that can be really helpful in getting the counselor familiar with your case and what's needed. Now, your school transcript is important. I mean, it's going to determine if you're coming in and you're saying, I want to be a veterinarian, or I want to be an auto mechanic. It's important to see where you're at in your academic process, so the counselor can determine what are the next steps. ACCES-VR, depending on what your goals are, can be an iterative process in terms of, okay, for now we agree to pay to this level. If you do of services or coaching or tutoring or whatever else it is, then you make that progress, and then you can go back to ACCES-VR and ask for more services. So I know there's a question outstanding in the chat about SSI. I'm going to take that in a few slides where we have some more information on employment and benefits. So during high school, and this is important, this is when we're talking about ages, at the beginning of 14 through 16, 18, 19, 20, the years that you technically are eligible for services within the DOE. Here's a list of services that are generally available. A lot of the services fall under this kind of new category. It's been around for a few years. PREETS, pre-employment transition services. This is where ACCES-VR can help you with things like community work experience. That could be, I know people have been placed to work at Yankee Stadium, to work at other places, and that's paid by ACCES-VR. There's a career exploration assessment, which you can do with your counselor and can also be paid for. There's career counseling that can be done both internally with your counselor at ACCES-VR as well as outsourced to other agencies. And importantly, I think there's work-based learning and internship opportunities. And what makes ACCES-VR unique is that if they assign you to an internship program that they work with, they are going to be covering the bill of that internship. So interestingly enough, the Department of Education on its own provides pre-ed services. This is something you can get through the TCAC centers, through the Transition College Access Centers within the New York City DOE. You don't per se have to apply and become eligible for these services through ACCES-VR, but you can. Also, during high school, there is public benefits counseling, which is something that's done usually through the ILC, the Independent Living Centers, and they can address questions like SSI and ACCES-VR. And I think I'll take this moment to answer that question. The answer is yes, you can absolutely have ACCES-VR and SSI. SSI has a limit, right? That limit tends to be somewhere under $1,000. And then that would be that would be included in the financial formula. But that $1,000 is going to go to your food, your housing, and other things. I mean, if you're going to college, or you're getting vocational training, you're getting some of the other things that are coming up on the next slide, you're not gonna have that money. So you will still be considered in need, and ACCES-VR would cover those services. And vice versa, just because ACCES-VR is helping you with certain employment goals or needs, you would not lose your SSI. It's not considered financial need. There's a lot more that can be discussed on this. Yes, there are people with SSI that can get full employment. That's a benefits counseling question. That could be 1619B. That can be a whole array of different formulas. A whole array of different formulas that go into that counseling. Importantly on this slide is the assessments. ACCES-VR, as many of you may know, neuropsych evaluations can cost several $1,000s. Vocational assessments can cost several $1,000s. ACCES-VR can pay for those services. Next up, we have what happens after high school. And I think what's important to note here is that it's important to understand that you can get ACCES-VR services while you're in high school, when you're out of high school, and as an adult. And there's kind of different levels to it. Interestingly enough, as you get older in the DOE in high school, there's somewhat less services available to you because you're getting ready to graduate or move on or whatever that looks like for you. The older you get with ACCES-VR, the more services that are available to you. Once you are of working age, once you have a work history or you've done your training, that's when a lot of these services will kick in that you see on the screen right now. Now, this says approximately ages 18 to 25. You can get these services older. What's important is for purposes of ACCES-VR, when you're under the age of 25, you are considered a youth transition applicant. And that's a certain category where many of these things that are on here: job training, job coaching, coaching supports, things like that. Some of these do have to do with OPWDD as well, and I'm not going to go through the intricacies of that, but just for you to be aware. Then very important is transportation costs. Whether you're a student with a disability, physical disability, IDD, autism, if you need help with transportation, getting to a training program, getting to your internship, getting to your job, even if you need accessible transportation, it's all covered. Again, help with school and vocational training costs, your tuition. That does not mean that, if you're going to a college that, may have a $40,000 a year tuition cost, that entirety would be covered. There's a formula, there are certain maxes, there are certain limits, but it can be pretty substantial, several $1,000s a semester I've seen for sure. Also, generally your college or wherever your vocational program is responsible for certain accommodations. That could be, note takers or certain assistive technology. For whatever reason, if your college isn't able to provide it or it's a certain type of program, ACCES-VR can pay for it. You need a computer at home, right? Your college or your vocational program may not pay for your computer at home. But that is something that you can ask for ACCES-VR. Hey, I can't do my job unless I have a computer at home. I can't do my job unless I have this assistive technology because you work from home. So there's an array of different things that can be covered. I will say this is a pretty comprehensive list, and yet there's still more. You can really ask for, I don't want to be overbroad here, but almost anything as it relates to what can help you get employment, what can help you find a job. And we're going to talk about a little bit more of what goes into that in a few minutes. But I do want to mention a couple more things on this list here. You see there's adaptive driver training. That's something they pay for. They also pay for adaptive vehicle modifications. What's interesting is obviously that is a significant amount of money. Could be anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 if you're a wheelchair user or not, or something else. But at the same time, that is an example of something that's called a one-time, generally considered a one-time, once-in-a-lifetime expense. So there's certain things, depending on the categories and regulations of ACCES-VR, that you can only get once in your life, once in your eligibility criteria. There's also physical and mental restoration services. This is pulled from their website and their guidebook. That means things like PT, mental health counseling. If those are all things that you need for purposes of getting your job, that's what you would get. Now, that's an interesting example of where comparable benefit may come into play. Let's say you do have Medicaid as well. Let's say you have some kind of other insurance. ACCES-VR would probably require that you apply for it through your insurance first, or through your Medicaid benefit, and get it approved that way. And if it's not covered, then that's where that would come into a conversation with your counselor or a conversation with ACCES-VR. Modifications to your home, also generally considered a once-in-a-lifetime benefit. But if you need your office adapted or something built out that helps you work, certainly all things that are possible. I think I'll take the liberty a little bit of, I hope everyone understands what job coaching is, coaching supports on the job. I mean, that's a very important category, specifically if you are someone who may need that on the job support. That is something that could be paid for, to have a job coach who's with you all the time through the supported employment model. There is some overlap with that in terms of OPWDD, but that's something that the agencies at times work on together. And feel free to ask me any questions if you'd like me to talk about any one of these more specifically. But this list could have been twice as long. Again, we kept it this way to give you an idea. In theory, there is no limit to what you can ask for, as long as it's reasonably connected to something you need to get a job. Next up, and this is something that can happen between the ages of 18 and 25, but it generally is at any age, job placement services. This is a really big deal. Some of this is generally done with your counselor, but then ACCES-VR works with an array of providers that help you look for your job. Community work experience, job search and placement, job readiness training, resumes, interviews, all those things, work-based coaching and supports. What do you need at your job? A lot of times, ACCES, you may be working with an employer, and you want to set up an arrangement where a coach is available with you on the job, at least at the beginning, to get you going, maybe a year, maybe some, usually not longer, but that's something that ACCES-VR can be paid for. That does not have to come out of the employer's pocket. It's a pretty big deal. Employment customization, there's certain providers that can work with employers to tailor a job to you. Again, that process takes a bit of time, but it's something that can be covered if it's needed. Extended job placement services means even after you've been employed, for a year, if there's a reason that you need to, ACCES-VR can help you look for a new job, help you find an additional, a better job. And that's why it's kind of technically job placement services would end once you have a job. But even if you're in that job, there's a category of extended job placement services that will allow you to keep searching or finding something alternate or alternative. Work tryout is important. This is something, and on the job training, you have an employer who might be interested in you, but maybe there's some question as to your ability to do the work. This is a situation where ACCES-VR would pay your salary. ACCES-VR would maybe take a 3-month trial. The employer would have no out-of-pocket costs. They'll pay your salary. Hopefully it goes great, and the employer sees that you're performing to an acceptable level, and everybody's happy. And then ACCES-VR's work tryout salary benefit would sunset, and the employer would take over. And similar for on-the-job training and a lot of things that some of the other things you see listed here. Occupational tools and equipment, licenses, if you do need some kind of equipment, this could be a big deal, depending what it is. Maybe you need a very specific piece of technology. Maybe you need a camera, right? You want to be a photographer. ACCES-VR can cover the cost of that camera. Again, it goes through the financial need review, and it goes through certain other reviews, but that is something that they could technically pay for. Maybe you're applying for a certain business license that's very expensive. They can help with that if that's something that you need in order to work. And as you'll see, we will be sharing this slide deck. There are links to the sections at the bottom here that go to their website that talk about certain parts of this, certain that explain kind of what's on the screen and can provide you some more information. So next, we're going to talk about the Individualized Plan for Employment. This is very important. This is the plan that is created with your counselor that is it is your contract to some degree between you and ACCES-VR in terms of what are they going to cover? What are they going to be paying for? It's a written plan. It lists your specific employment goal. It outlines the services ACCES-VR will provide and the steps you need to take. Certain vocational training, certain vocational goals have numerous steps. That could be a vocational program followed by maybe you need to take some kind of licensing test. Maybe you need a computer training followed by certification. Maybe you want to get your graduate degree. You go to bachelor, you get your bachelor's degree, and then the next step is your master's degree. Those are things that can be outlined. It's very important to have an IPE. It is a living document, and it can be revised and changed as you go on, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Generally, it's written by you and your vocational rehabilitation counselor together. It's a conversation, it's dialogue. What's possible? What do you want on there? And it's a joint document. Now, You can write it yourself. There is a form. You can talk to your school counselors. You can talk to your parents, your families. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can write the IP. Importantly, it must be mutually agreed upon and signed by you and the vocational rehabilitation counselor. This sounds like a really simple step. It's not that simple. If you write the IPE and your vocational counselor doesn't agree with it based on maybe it's not connected to your goal, maybe they don't, ACCES-VR doesn't think you can achieve it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But if they don't agree with you and with what's in your plan, they may not cover those benefits, and that's a really, really big deal. There's things that they'll be looking at in terms of putting your IPE together is how your disability affects your ability to work, what type of job it is it, what's your ability to do that job generally, what's your work history. So those are just some of the factors that play into creating an IPE. You should always get a written copy for your records. It's really important to have this, because this is, to some degree, this is what you look back at over the years as services that are approved for you. Now, it really formalizes the entire planning process. What's important to know is that the IPE can be changed, and that's actually a good thing. Let's say originally, let's say you are looking to be a veterinarian or a computer technician, and you're just coming out of high school. Maybe your grades weren't so good. Maybe you had some other challenges. ACCES-VR, and let's say you have assessments, a neuropsych or a vocational assessment. You have different evaluations. Maybe those assessments don't say, well, they're not going to, they won't say, hey, you're going to be a veterinarian tomorrow. Or those assessments may, be more limiting in terms of what they're recommending. So, and you go, hey, I believe I can achieve it. I know I can do it. At that first step, they may not agree. I mean, and I'll talk about your due process rights if you don't agree with ACCES-VR. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But what I would recommend to you is, hey, take what you can get. ACCES-VR maybe will approve for you your first 2 years of school and certain other things. And then, hey, you cross that threshold, you come in with a new transcript, you come in with a new certificate, and you go, hey, I want to update my IP. I want to keep going. And that's something that's absolutely acceptable and absolutely something you should consider doing. As you do better, your ability to reasonably demonstrate that you can keep going toward your career goal will be able to move that needle forward. So I see there's a couple questions in the chat. I'm going to answer them in 1 or 2 slides. So what's important about on this slide, specifically about getting services and approvals? Everything at ACCES-VR is individualized based on your profile. Now, you can call ACCES-VR tomorrow and be like, hey, what do you guys offer? Hey, what about someone who's in my situation? Do you have any providers that would be right for me? I will tell you that probably 95% of the time, they'll tell you to go look at their website, and they'll tell you it's individualized. They'll tell you, we don't know until we see everything. We don't know until we go through the assessments and make a plan. That can be a little bit frustrating at times because you don't seem to get clear answers, but it kind of suggests there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Once you do submit your application, once counselors review it, it is something that will get a lot more individualized once you move forward. It's just at the outset, even myself and certain students that I'm helping or kids that I'm helping, the fact that they will only go so far in terms of answering your hypotheticals. Even if you give ACCES-VR counselors or their supervisors the most detailed hypothetical, they will at times revert back to, hey, it's individualized. I don't know until I see it. So on one hand, that's frustrating. On the other hand, I encourage you to look at it as a somewhat positive thing, because, depending where you're at in your career journey and what your career goals are, the individualized aspect of it can be really helpful to you, because you can get help, and the whole spectrum of career goals. Again, now, as you move forward in the process, it's important to be specific. The more you share with your counselor, the more that goes into your IPE, the more likely you're going to get services requested. I mean, if you're not being specific and you're not sure where you're going or what you want to do, a limited amount of services may be approved around career exploration, around some counseling, maybe some assessments, and then see where those come out before ACCES-VR approves you for services. I mean, if you have an idea of what your interests are and you know, hey, it's computer-based, you know, that opens up a whole other world in terms of, hey, we have this computer provider, we have this training course, hey, we have this kind of program at the school, and all kinds of other things. So it's a little bit of a disservice to yourself, honestly, if you're not somewhat specific. It may slow the process down significantly. Now, you may be applying at 16, 17, 18 years old, where you've got some time and you just want the assessments and you want to explore some things. And that's totally fine. If you're applying at a bit of an older age, or you're applying at a point where you really know what you want to do, you really want to come in there and tell them, because that will really be helpful to you. Let me take this opportunity to answer a few questions we have in the chat. The question about if you had ACCES-VR services years ago and now you'd like to get back in, it generally depends. If you haven't done anything with ACCES-VR in a while, they usually will send you an email and notice that your case has been closed. If your case has been closed, you would generally have to start from scratch, but sometimes that does move a little bit faster. If your case is not closed, but you haven't gotten a service in a year or two, they're still, based on what new services you're asking for, what your new goals are, they will do a financial need review based on the last year. They'll look at your transcripts, they'll look at the status of your disability, and they will make a determination based on your current situation. So it depends on whether or not your case has been fully closed. Is job coaching a financial need-based service? I believe that job coaching is not. Let me, there is a, on the financial, I'm going to send a link in the chat towards the end where there's a list of all the financial need-based services and not, and I'll also update it on the slide so you have it. Moving on, so assessments and progress toward your work goal play an important role. Sometimes you may say, this is what I want to be. ACCES-VR may be like, look, your transcripts, you know, maybe your disability. Hey, you know, I myself am a quadriplegic. If I went to ACCES-VR and I said I wanted to be an auto mechanic, they may say, hey, I'm not sure. I myself have paralysis, that's what I was saying. They may say, we're not sure that you can achieve that based on your disability. You know, it's a very difficult conversation to have. I've had that conversation myself. I became an attorney with some assistance from ACCES-VR. This is certainly some years ago. And there was some times where, you know, there was difficult conversations. You have to advocate for yourself. I'm going to talk about the due process rights. If you don't agree with them, you can fight them in the sense of advocating and going to hearing. But the best way to get access, to convince ACCES-VR that, hey, you should be paying for this graduate school or this next level of training, or I really need this major home modification, is to make progress, right? You do better, you get the grades, you keep moving through your school, you keep moving through your training, then it makes it harder for them to, you know, tell you, well, we don't think you can do this, right? And those are some dicey conversations that we're happy to help out with if you need to have those conversations. What else that's important on the slide is it must be an approved ACCES-VR provider. ACCES-VR does not share their list of providers, but many providers out there, schools, colleges, training programs, tend to be ACCES-VR providers. If you're asking for a service to be covered that's not from an ACCES-VR provider, an approved provider, then you won't be able to benefit from that service. It's certainly a little bit different than OPWDD or other services where you have some more discretion. The funds that ACCES-VR releases do go directly to the provider. Now, there's a very large list of providers. I'm sure it's everything from grad schools and law schools to vocational training programs to community-based organizations doing internships. There's a lot of providers, but it's something for you to be aware of. If you're looking for a service that is not an approved provider, they may have to sign up, which is a process that they can go through. Moving on. I talked about this a little bit already. When you go into your interview or your meeting with your counselor, come in with a list of general interests. This will be very helpful. I will say that it should be the ACCES-VR counselor's job to, kind of say, here is what you should be doing. Here are some ideas. Some counselors are better than others, and you should be aware of that. If you come in and you don't have any idea, some counselors may say, come back when you're ready. They may not say it exactly like that, but that's what it'll feel like. Other counselors will really engage and be like, well, what do you like to do? What are your hobbies? But in order for you to end up in the best place, I highly recommend you come in certainly with a list of general interests. Obviously, if you know exactly what you want to do, the more likely that you'll be able to move forward in terms of getting the services you're requesting and putting together a good IPE. Communication is very important. Like all government agencies, ACCES-VR has a pretty long list, and it varies by borough, but all the borough offices have have a pretty significant wait list to get a counselor. And then even once you do get a counselor, getting to the point of getting an IP, getting services approved, it can take a pretty long time. That is why it's encouraged, before you actually need ACCES-VR services to fully kick in, you should easily start a year in advance. Some services can be approved faster, but certainly some of the, quote unquote, maybe higher end services or certain services that are more expensive, ACCES-VR will require some justification. Maybe you'll need an eval, maybe you'll need an assessment before they're willing to approve it. So start early. Also, if you haven't heard from your counselor, it's your job to follow up. I imagine many of you have dealt with various government agencies, whether it's the DOE, OPWDD, ACCES-VR is no different. I will say in my experience, they're a little bit faster than OPWDD on certain things. That being said, it can be a slow process, and it is important that you understand you have to self-advocate, you have to follow up. That's really important. So we just have 1 or 2 slides left, and then we'll open it up to some questions. So, very important slide. What are your due process rights? What are your appeal rights? What if your IPE or requested service is not approved? You do have a right to appeal the decision. ACCES-VR has several layers that you can, several versions of appeal. Informal review, that would go up to a supervisor. You'd have a conversation. Administrative review, that goes up to a team within the ACCES-VR district office, and that will be reviewed. There's also mediation, where you come in and it's literally a negotiation of, hey, I want this service. Hey, why don't you think I can go to this school? Hey, I do need a car modification. Hey, I do need a home modification. Yeah, job coaching services were really important for me. I really believe I can do this job, and see where you land. Obviously, last resort would be impartial hearing. You can file for an impartial hearing with the judge. You have to request any appeal within 90 days of the decision. After which point, if you don't request, then you have to make the request again before you can appeal it. Certain things that are appealable: agreement on job goals, really big deal. Sometimes if ACCES-VR, the counselor or the supervisor don't agree with your job goals, you may need to appeal it. You may need to get an assessment and then appeal it to show that, yes, I can do this. And this certainly comes into play with certain learning disabilities or certain other kinds of disabilities, where ACCES-VR will want to see some quote unquote tangible proof or tangible document showing that there's a reasonable expectation of completion of whatever you're asking for. If they don't cover an evaluation or assessment, you can appeal that. Denial of services, they don't want to pay for your school, your college, your job coaching, internship, something like that, you can appeal all that. Your IP, you're not agreeing on it. No matter how far you've tried, it's a sticking point for you. You can appeal what is on your IPE. Also, employment placement. Let's say they give you a job that you're not happy with. You're like, this isn't for me. This isn't what I signed up for. You're giving me a job, or you're placing me in an employer that I don't think is right for me. And here are all the reasons. And we need to keep searching. We need to keep going back to the drawing board. You sometimes individuals are looking for jobs for years, and I've been in that situation myself after I sustained my disability. So important to know. This is something that you can do on your own. Lawyers can do it, but importantly, ACCES-VR works with Disability Rights in New York. They're Albany-based, but they have offices throughout the city, and they can provide you legal representation. It is called, as you'll see on the next slide. Oh, sorry, let me go back one slide. It is called the Client's Assistance Program. And there'll be links to it at the end of this presentation. You can reach out to them. They can give you advice on ACCES-VR. They can represent you in a hearing. They can provide a variety of different tools to help you get to a resolution, including negotiating. Now, you may think that, hey guy, you call them and be like, I want a hearing tomorrow. DRNY does have some discretion in terms of, hey, we're not at that point yet. We haven't tried an informal review. We haven't submitted a letter. So they themselves, it's not a situation where you can just call and say, hey, I want to go to hearing right away. They may choose to represent you, they may not, depending on your situation. But I think the best standard to understand where they come from is they will pursue all available alternative means of resolution before considering representation at a hearing. So it is their job. They are paid by the state to represent you and help you with these issues, but that doesn't automatically mean that you can just go to hearing. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send them in. I'm just got one or two more slides. I mean, this is important. There's a lot of resources on this. Advocates for Children has their Advocates for Children has our own guide for applying for ACCES-VR. Take a look at that. There is a recent update to new services that are available through ACCES-VR, the pre-employment services and transition services update. This is a good link to it. There's a pre-ETS brochure that explains all the different internships, career exploration, career counseling, all the different things that are available with that. The entire ACCES-VR service list is right here. Is right here, and you can look at all the services. Specifically, the transition services brochure is here. Due process rights, client assistance program, and youth transition services. Importantly, at the end here is the independent living centers. They do have benefits counselors and community counselors that can help you apply for ACCES-VR. Independent living centers do have partnerships with ACCES-VR to help people apply, to get people into the system and get them going. So I'm just going to make I'm going to send in the chat to everyone the link that you requested on the financial, on the what's a one-time service, what's a need-based service. So give me 1 second. I will, let me pull that link up. I will send that to everyone. Okay, here it goes. Okay. Feel free to take a look at that. I will also add that to the presentation. Some last kind of closing, some last closing tips. I would say start early. It does take time to get through the ACCES-VR process. Be prepared to advocate for yourself. You may come in, and I experienced this myself, and I experienced this with clients that I've assisted. Some counselors may not agree with you, and it's not always the counselor's decision. A lot of these IPEs do go up to the counselor's supervisor. Advocate for yourself. Start early. Don't take no for an answer. I know we say that all the time, but I think it's important. At the same time, you need to ACCES-VR can be an incredible benefit, but it is a little bit different than special education in the sense that generally in IEP meetings or with the DOE or other types of services, no one is gonna, you don't usually hear, well, we don't think you can become a veterinarian. We don't think you can do this. In ACCES-VR, that is something that you may hear in their government guidelines that are approved by law. There's you have to have a reasonable career goal. There's got to be a reasonable expectation of completion. Again, as I've advised you, I think that's something you can iteratively get to, but just be prepared for potentially an uncomfortable conversation depending on what you're asking for. I think short of those kinds of things, ACCES-VR has a lot of opportunities for internships. They cover a lot of services on the employer side, on the on the agency side. They have a lot of resources. So I encourage you to utilize ACCES-VR as part of your career journey, and certainly for parents as you're advocating for your young child or your young adult child. You can certainly be involved in the IPE planning process. You can help write that together. You can be as involved as your child feels is right, or as you feel is right. I see one comment. 1 second. Yeah. The point that you bring up in terms of, doing so many services at once is a point well taken. I mean, there's DOE special education services, and sometimes there are after school services, whether it's tutoring, transition coordination services, ABA sets, a variety of different services. You can only fit so many of those in a day, I would say, and certainly it can be difficult to do certain types of career planning when you're right in high school. That is one of the reasons why ACCES-VR, although technically you can get in at 14, they don't always recommend it. I do think I do think it's something you need to work through. I will say, as I share with my younger sisters and others, the sooner you get started, the better. But at the same time, you're still young, and it's better to slowly get into the career planning, getting into the career planning process. So even if what I've seen that doesn't work particularly well is if you get a career or vocational assessment too early. Let's say you do it at 14 and 15, nothing really comes out of that. You're a little bit too young, then that assessment doesn't help you. And neither ACCES-VR nor the DOE are going to pay for these assessments every year or every other year. Certainly within some time periods, you can get new assessments, but you want to make sure you plan them and time them right to be helpful to you, which is true for neuropsych evaluations, vocational assessments, other kinds of career exploration assessments. Again, because they do cost several thousands of dollars. So that's that. Any other last questions? It's been a pleasure being